All right, let's take a look at chord tones. So the overarching theme, or one of the overarching themes of this course, is to get away from relying on scales or thinking about scales as a basis for soloing in jazz. There are many ways to create a much more musical, more organic way of soloing and thinking about the instrument and thinking about music. And one of the ways that is very important when you address jazz as a beginner or an intermediate student of the music is to think about chord tones. Some people call this vertical soloing or a vertical approach. And what they mean by that is instead of a linear approach such as a scale and just taking a scale and trying to fit it on a particular chord type in a tune, thinking vertically, or the arpeggios, the chord tones. So chord tones literally are the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 7. Those 4 notes in a 7th chord. Okay, so a major 7th chord, for example, the chord tones would be 1, 3, 5, 7. So now that we've explored the different neighborhoods of the fretboard, and within each neighborhood, the 5 cage shapes that you can access in every single neighborhood of the neck, now what we can do is add the concepts of rhythm and rhythmic phrasing that we explored, and we put those things together along with, the chord tones, and we can start to make music now. So what this next lesson is all about is in each of the neighborhoods, playing through a simple 2-5-1 progression in the key of C major, using lines that are extracted from these shapes within each of the 5 neighborhoods, and then employing rhythm, anticipation, delayed attack, and ultimately syncopation to create music. So what we're going to do is take a look at the 5 neighborhoods, and we're just going to briefly explore where these lines come from, and then we'll play along with a track. If we take a look at example 1, this is in our first neighborhood, or we can call it region 1, and we're in the key of C, so this is ultimately derived from a C shape. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the lesson on the neighborhoods, in every neighborhood you can find the different chord shapes, including the tweaked chord shapes such as minor 7 and dominant 7 that we explored. So in this particular example, we have 3 chords to deal with: D minor 7, which is the 2, G7, which is the 5, and then that could be further embellished whether it's altered or not, but let's just stick with a plain G7 right now. And then the 1 chord, C major 7. So that means in this first neighborhood, we've got 3 chord shapes to just kind of pull out. So we have our D minor 7, G7, and C major 7. Now those aren't necessarily chord voicings that I would use in a real musical sense. I'm just kind of mapping out the notes. I'm aware of where the notes are. So as a warm-up exercise, you may want to review those shapes. So in this neighborhood, just review the notes that you have available for D minor 7, and then the notes for a G7 in that neighborhood. And then finally the notes in that neighborhood for C major 7. So on one hand you could think, well, all of those chord tones belong to the C major scale. But the problem is, if you just think C major scale for all of those chords, and the way you think affects your phrasing, and it doesn't really sound musical, and it doesn't exactly pinpoint the sound of each chord. It just sounds like you're kind of throwing a C major blanket scale on top of it, and it doesn't really have the same power and intention as really sculpting out the vertical chord tones for each chord. So now that we've outlined the chord tones for each of those 3 chords in this example, by adding rhythm, we can create some musical phrases. So let's pull up the track, and I'm going to play the first example. I'm going to loop it a couple of times, and you can hear how this is starting to sound like music. Here we go, 3 and. 3 and. Okay, so That might be, not the first position I would think of to solo over that particular chord, but it's just merely an example of how to extract the notes from each of the 5 cage shapes within one neighborhood to play over 2-5-1 progression and adding rhythmic elements such as delayed attack, syncopation, and anticipation to create a musical statement. Let's take the next example, which explores region 2. So this is ultimately derived from the A shape. And again, just like I demonstrated before, in this particular neighborhood, we have all 5 shapes, chord shapes, coexisting. So what you might want to do initially is just kind of map out the chord tones for each of these 3 chords. So here's D minor 7, G7, and then C major 7. All 3 of those shapes are coexisting in that one neighborhood. Okay? So let's pull up the track again, and let's play this next example, and we'll loop that a couple of times before we move on. So we'll play it twice through. Here we go with the track. 2, 3, and... Maybe different articulations. All right, so you can hear in that last example, just adding the rhythm and the rhythmic phrasing ideas is the first step to bringing it to life. Then you can do all of the things that you like to normally play on guitar, slurring such as slides, hammer-ons, picking, all of the different ways to articulate something to make it come to life. All right, let's continue on with the third example. This would be region 3, originally coming from the G shape. So this is a C major in the key of C using the G shape. So in this particular neighborhood, we have D minor 7, G7, and then C major. Let's try playing along with the track. 1, 2, 3, and... All right, so you'll notice in that last example, I started playing around with it a little bit, and I really encourage you to do that. Once you get these examples under your fingers, which will take no time at all, once you get them under your fingers and in your ears, then start playing with that. So essentially, you're starting along the path of improvisation. You're improvising articulation by maybe adding in, pull off or a slide or a hammer on or a pick note or anything. And then eventually you can improvise just little rhythmic variations like I started to do in that. And that can be a part of a truly organic practice routine because you're making music based on a phrase that you're hearing. So this would be something down the road. For example, if you transcribe a line, then you can make that line your own by doing these, adding different rhythmic embellishments, different phrasing embellishments, and so forth. All right, let's check out the next example with the track. This would be region 4 coming out of the E shape. All right, with the track, here we go. 1, 2, 3, and... Now let's explore this next line using region 5, which is the D shape. So ultimately, we're coming from the key of C using the D shape. And in this particular neighborhood, we have our D minor 7, G7, C major 7. So let's pull up the track and play along. And then after we play through this example, we're going to pull up the track. Actually, let's keep the track rolling. I'm going to play region 5 example, and then I'm going to put all 5 of those together. And you can hear it, and it will start to sound like a solo happening by putting them all together. So let's play the region number 5 example first with the track. 3 and... One final thing to think about as you work through this concept of playing chord tones. In a sense, there's always a safety net underneath you, because if you're really just focusing on the 4 chord tones, all of those notes will sound good. They're safe. You'll never play a bad note if you just focus on the chord tones. So for example, in each of those 5 examples that we played through, we land on different notes of the C major chord. You know, sometimes we resolve and finish the phrase on the root. Other times it's the 3rd, other times it's the 5th, other times it's the 7th. And all 4 of those notes will sound good. That's the whole point. As opposed to playing a scale, if we landed on the 4th, it might not sound as good. It would maybe sound wrong. But so all of these notes, you're good. You don't have to worry about anything. But even more importantly than that, it will, by exploring each of these neighborhoods, it will allow you to see new possibilities with the notes that you choose to resolve on. And you'll find yourself resolving on notes that you might not otherwise have landed on before in the past by using, older patterns or things that you're more accustomed to doing. By exploring, for example, this particular neighborhood that resolves by using a D shape, that would force you to learn new notes in that particular neighborhood and then create a much more interesting phrase, because maybe you're not used to resolving a phrase on the 7th, for example, and that's going to really make your playing come alive by resolving on new to you pitches. It's it's the same level of excitement and interest when you're driving around in a new neighborhood and checking it out. So you're like, oh yeah, there's where the coffee shop is, and oh yeah, that's where the library is, and there's where the pizza is, and all of those things. It's part of the fun of discovering new regions of the neck and subsequently discovering new ways to resolve your phrases.